start by just taking you through the sequence of events, because this really is how it all started. India's lawmakers had actually united to pay homage to the fallen in remembrance of what had happened in the Parliament terror attack all those decades ago. This is where it started. But hours later, the lower house chamber was filled with yellow-colored, non-toxic gas, and mobile phone videos showed MPs cutting across party lines, bashing up one of the two youths who had actually managed to create a security lapse in the country's most secure complex. And this is a new parliament complex which had even higher security. And those unprecedented scenes obviously ensured a social media frenzy and concern all across the country. The explicit coincidence that this particular intrusion happened on a day when India was remembering one of the saddest days in its parliamentary history, well, that coincidence was not also lost on anybody. And of course, as these images continue to flash and inside both houses of parliament, there was concern and security agencies were trying to make sense of the intrusion. The nation's lawmakers were now busy in verbal duels, and chaos continued. Images of 4 people, 2 of them held by MPs, 2 of them arrested by the Delhi police just outside the new parliament complex. So all of that continued to happen. But after that, after all of this drama, was when the next level of drama then started to ensue, because the opposition started to demand that the government explain what exactly had happened. And to be more specific, the opposition started to demand that the Home Minister, Amit Shah, come and make a statement. Now, what happened after that? When no statement was being made, the opposition started to protest in the well of the House with placards, trooping inside, other such things. This is disruption of Parliament, which we have seen in the past also, and it's never pretty to see, and there is disruption. But this time what happened was also somewhat unprecedented. A lot of those opposition leaders who were trooping into the well of the House and who were protesting then were suspended. They were suspended across the board. Nearly 150 opposition MPs ended up being suspended. And that was unprecedented, and that led to a lot of questions actually being asked inside and outside. Then 2 further things happened which added to the drama around the entire week. Number 1, these scenes started to be seen, that opposition MPs protesting outside, protesting on the streets, and that was getting a certain amount of sympathy perhaps for them from some quarters. But then these scenes started to be seen that as the opposition MPs were sitting there outside Parliament, one MP in particular started to mimic the vice president. And that particular video and shots of Congress leader Rahul Gandhi actually filming Kalyan Banerjee, that went viral on social media. That led to its own storm. That led to statements by the vice president, by the prime minister, by the president of India, saying that this is a shocking attack on a constitutional functionary. So that led to its own set of drama and its own set of issues. But let's now just step aside from all that drama to see, where did all of this actually end up? And that is something that we also have to take a look at because of its implication for what could happen in Parliament and parliamentary democracy and what the government should do and what the opposition should do going forward. Because at the end of the day, what all of this resulted in was started the suspension of 14 MPs on the December the 14th, and it became 78 MPs on December the 18th, and further MPs being suspended. So by the time we're speaking right now, it's about nearly 150 MPs have been suspended. Now, the last time mass suspension at this level happened was in 1989 under the Rajiv Gandhi regime. At that time, it was the Thakkar Commission report on Indira Gandhi's assassination that was creating a storm. And because of that, the opposition erupted in protests in March of 1989. 63 lawmakers eventually were suspended. But the action against them at that time was short-lived because the MPs apologized to Speaker the next day and they were allowed to resume their parliamentary duties. Now, coming back to 2023, none of that has actually happened. The opposition MPs have intensified their protests. Demonstrations are continuing. And now what has happened is that in that opposition-less parliament, with no actual debate and discussion between the government and the opposition, some really critical and crucial bills have actually been passed. On December the 21st, the Lok Sabha has passed a bill to regulate the appointment of the election commissioners. And this, by the way, is a somewhat controversial bill in any case, because you've had the opposition saying that this weakens checks and balances because the Chief Justice is no longer there to decide who the election commissioners are. Instead, there's the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition and a minister appointed by the government. So the government's going to get to decide election commissioners, and what does that do for checks and balances? That's what the opposition has been saying. Rajya Sabha, by the way, has already cleared that bill. On December the 20th, the Lok Sabha cleared the redrafted criminal law bills. Now, if you've been watching the India story, you know our view on this. Reforming the Indian judicial system is perhaps the biggest and the most important item on the agenda for India right now. So those criminal law bills deserve a lot of attention. They deserve debate. They deserve discussion. They've been passed now. That's fine. But, could they have been made even better? And should there be changes? And can we get consensus around fixing the judicial system? That's what we would have hoped for. But obviously, if the bills are being passed in a house without the opposition, there will always be some question marks around that. So we'll have to see how that actually plays out at the end of the day. Now, there are two things that are actually happening out here. And as we get our guests in to discuss all of this, there are two slightly separate issues that need to be looked at. One is the politics of it all. Because what the government is saying is that here you have an opposition that was breaching the maryada of Parliament. Look at what they were doing on the floor of the House. They were disrupting Parliament. They were not allowing it to continue. We have to have bills being passed, and the opposition cannot be allowed to disrupt Parliament. That's point number one. And secondly, the government is saying the mimicry of the Vice President was something that was unacceptable, and that is something that has to be dealt with. Staying with the politics of it, what is happening on the opposition side is, again, two things. Number one, the entire suspension becomes something that the opposition used to try and put itself together, bring itself together, try and find issues to talk about, to say democracy is in danger. We did have that meeting of the India Alliance where lots of interesting things happened, including one that we will look at in some detail later in the program, the fact that Mallikarjun Kharge was named by at least two opposition leaders as a possible prime ministerial candidate. But aside from that, the entire suspensions became an issue for the opposition to try and reunite and come together after the severe setbacks that we saw in the assembly election, especially for the Congress party. But that's at the political level. Moving away from the political level, something else that all of this does raise some questions about, which have raised to some questions that we need to get answered, is what does that mean for the parliamentary democracy itself and for the system of checks and balances? And I'll tell you why this is something which is being taken seriously by many analysts and experts from the opposition and even from the government, because nobody really wants a situation where you're not having the proper functioning of parliamentary democracy, or for that matter, where the system of checks and balances are in doubt. Why is it important? Well, that should be obvious. Look, the way democracy functions is at multiple levels. Number one is the system of elections. It's great for, any democracy should have a system where you go and you vote, and if you're voting somebody in or you're voting somebody out, then that is being respected. So that's part one of any democratic process. And let's face it, that's some place where India has never had an issue in its entire history. So that's great. The second aspect of democracy is obviously the concept of individual rights and individual freedoms and the extent to which those are being safeguarded. And it's interesting that, for example, and the role of the criminal justice system in safeguarding that was actually being spoken about very strongly by the government itself on the floor of the House and Parliament. So that's a second aspect of democracy, which is individual rights and individual freedoms. But the third part of a democracy is the entire system of checks and balances and how the executive works and the government works and how that responds to Parliament and what is the role that the judiciary plays in all of this and what is the role of the media and all of this. And that is the institutional framework that goes behind a democracy. So if you end up in a situation like we're seeing right now, and look, we can keep on debating who's to blame. I can tell you the opposition will say the government is to blame, the government will say the opposition is to blame. But whichever way you look at it, if you end up in a situation where Parliament is not functioning quite as well as it should, or that checks and balances, there are questions around, and are things not working perfectly, then that does lead to certain concerns. And you do need to try and find an answer to that. And why this is important, before we get into the politics of all of this, let's just speak to somebody who's been the Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, who can tell us why these checks and balances are important and how we can actually try to get Parliament to function in a better manner. So let's talk to him, and then we'll turn our attention to some of the politics. All right, we now have with us Mr. Achary, who's a former Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, 14th Lok Sabha, a little bit of the 15th Lok Sabha as well. So, Mr. Achary, thank you so much for joining us. These fairly unprecedented scenes that we have seen in Parliament over the last 1 week, I want to just get your sense first on how you react to this. What do you make of what's been happening in Parliament?
No, this is, as you put it, is very unprecedented because members have been suspended. A very large number of them have been suspended. And when they are out of the house, so many bills, and that too bills of very great importance. The bills which are making very large number of amendments on almost replacing the IPC, CRPC and Evidence Act and all that. Such bills of momentous importance are being passed when the opposition is practically out of the house because of the large-scale suspension of members. This is something which I have never seen, and it is quite unprecedented in the history of the Lok Sabha, of course, except one instance I can quote, that is in 1989, when about 63 members were suspended from the House.
So, Mr. Achary, you have a situation where nearly 150 members ended up getting suspended, which is virtually the entire opposition. And then in that situation, you're actually having bills being passed, which means, again, by definition, those bills are not really being debated and discussed that much. So this presumably is not something that is desirable, and we should try and find a way to get around it. Have you ever seen such scenes in the past? The government will be blaming the opposition blames the government. Between those extremes, how do you move forward in a situation like this?
Well, you see, as a former Secretary General, I can say that whenever such occasions arise, there is a demand. When there is a demand from the opposition and the government is not willing to oblige and things like that, so naturally there will be a stalemate and protest and all that. But then there is a way out of this. If the government is serious, the opposition is willing to respond, then there can be a meeting. In fact, the Prime Minister or the senior minister from the government can call a meeting of all the opposition leaders and discuss matters with them and find an amicable settlement. So that is the way. That is the way Parliament has functioned earlier. I mean, at least I have been there since 1970.
So, Mr. Achary, is there a fear that, look, there could be a point somewhere in the future, you could have a situation where the entire opposition just gets suspended, and then some major bills are passed, some constitutional amendments end up getting passed, and they get passed because there's no opposition there to actually be able to vote against it. Now, okay, I'm painting a doomsday scenario, but in light of what we've often seen, in light of what we've seen right now, are those the sort of concerns that could actually happen? And if you don't want that to happen, irrespective of who's in power, it's not this government or that government, whoever is in power, that's not a situation that we would ever want to happen. How do you make sure that that can never happen in the future? How do you maintain those checks and balances?
Well, that is a possibility. Looking at what is happening in Parliament these days, one can certainly conclude that maybe at some future date, this is going to happen. In fact, it is happening. The opposition is out of the house. And then all these various important bills are being passed. There is something very, very unusual about it. That is all I can say.
All right. Well, given the levels of confrontation, I'm not sure that anyone's really talking to each other right now. So any solution that you have in mind, how do you move forward from here?
See, a solution is there. The only thing is that you must grasp it. That is it. See, the point is that after all, it's a democratic country and it is a democratic house. And here, through democratic means, you must find solutions to issues. I don't think there is any issue which cannot be resolved through discussion and debate, provided there is a willingness or there is a proper attitude on both sides.
All right, Mr. Achary, thank you so much for joining us with that.
Thank you.
All right, let's now turn our attention to the politics of it all as well. What exactly is happening, and in particular, whatever's happening in Parliament, how could that have been avoided, and what's the best way to go forward? We're going to be joined by Shahzad Poonawala in just a couple of minutes as well. But Dr. Abhishek Manasunghi is joining us, constitutional expert, top lawyer, and also, of course, closely affiliated to the Congress Party. Dr. Singhvi, what we have been seeing in Parliament is clearly disturbing. It's sad that bills are being passed with the entire opposition missing because our nearly 150 MPs have been suspended. But the government will also say that the opposition has been disrupting Parliament, trooping into the well of the House, mimicking the Vice President. So the opposition is also to blame.
Vikram, let's just step back for a minute. It's a far larger and a more important issue that is made out in all this petty politics. There is, of course, an important constitutional aspect, but I'll come to that later. Let's look at contextually in the political aspect. What is the sequence, Vikram? You have an unprecedented security breach, unprecedented not because of the result of what happened that day, God and fate and good luck saved us, but what might have happened on that breach. A canister in it could have been a bomb, could have been anything. So on that step 2, we ask for something which is the most innocuous and ridiculously simple, obvious and obligatory thing to ask for in a functioning democracy, unless you are a kind of a auto mode pilot democracy. We say the Home Minister and the Prime Minister, or one of them at least, must give a statement on this breach. Number 3, on that there is absolute and total mulish obstinacy for over a week. The same gentlemen are speaking in media, in channels, at Varanasi, at Surat, at functions, but they refuse to come and speak in the House. Step 4, people go in with placards after 4 or 5 days of demanding it. And yes, placards are not permitted, but is it the first time, Vikram, you or the country has seen placards in the House? In the last 70 years, 7 years, 7 months, or 7 days, is it the first time you've seen it? Now, when you go there, an excuse is brought up that placards are not allowed, we will suspend you. You start with a batch of 40, becomes 80, becomes 142 or 148 at final count. All of this happens unrelated to, much before, anything to do with the so-called mimicry incident.
Dr. Singhvi, let me just...
both ways.
All right, I'm going to get others in also to discuss some of the constitutional, but let me just quickly ask you one last question on the politics of all of this, right? Because the politics of all of this is playing itself out when the India Alliance was also having a meeting. You've been trying to get the opposition unity. Does something like this unite the opposition further? Does it make the opposition feel that there's no hope because we're not likely to have power? And incidentally, there was also this entire question thrown up at the India Alliance, and I'm going to try and get others in on the concept of let's have a Mallikarjun Kharge as a uniting figure for the entire opposition. So what's the politics?
That's a lot of questions. Give me a couple of minutes. First of all, it does unite because the indignation is righteous, it is correct, and it cuts across the political spectrum. I dare say, Vikram, that if you were to ask in private, 50% of BJP members would say this is not parliamentary democracy was run. It's not the first time a BJP government has come. It's not the first time a non-Congress government has been there. There have been governments. There have been the whole core of parliamentary democracy is magnanimity. It is trust. It is give and take. It is compromise. It is talks. It is communication. These are things which are not tangible and quantifiable, and hence we try to ignore them. But according to me, this is the heart of parliamentary democracy. And prime ministers from Vajpayee to Vishwanath Pratap Singh, to Devagowda, to others have practiced it. Forget Congress. Now, the other question you are asking is, and remember, do not try and be digressed or diverted by this completely cheap tactics of bringing in the mimicry incident, about which the member concerned, Mr. Banerjee,
this you said.
It was well before. Now,
I'm just trying to move from this into the
about the Kharge thing, and that's the last point you asked me. Let me say very clearly, it must be understood that the person himself, Mr. Kharge, has given the perfect answer. He has himself addressed. So where's the question of me addressing it? Why are we counting our chickens before we hatch? Let us make them hatch first. Let's get the numbers. And then there is complete unanimity that we will decide in a convivial, congenial atmosphere. This is a view expressed in a free and frank discussion, no doubt. And this is, let me tell you, it's a view warmly expressed. It's a view not out of animus or out of malafide. But that doesn't mean that this here and now we must decide, because this is what, on the negative sense, the BJP would like to do, to try and set the cat amongst the pigeons, create confusion, create divisiveness. That is not the issue at all.
Okay, fine. Dr. Singhvi, thank you so much for joining us.